All right. This will be our last night of this class. And we're going to look at Appendix M. And if we have time, we'll look at Appendix U. That should finish most of the book that we want to cover. One of the problems we run into is the passages where God commanded the killing of whole groups of people, or brought it on by the flood, and does in Genesis 6 through 9. And so all people except the 8 that were in the ark died in the flood. And we see this, and we see also that the Lord ordered the killing of babies in 1 Samuel 15:3. And so this is, of course, one of the strongest arguments that I believe the atheists can bring up. And we can't deny this without denying what the scriptures plainly say. So the argument is that the Lord Jehovah Yahweh is wicked to kill babies, and there are at least 5 flaws in this argument. So we want to look at the flaws. The first flaw, logical flaws, is that the argument is the atheist must assume that because he's an atheist, he must assume there's no fundamental difference between a human baby and a baby cockroach, or a human baby and a baby mouse, or some other animal. And because basically he just argues that humans and other people, other things, other animals are just matter in motion. And in other words, there's no difference, fundamental difference. And he has no way of distinguishing between the two. I asked a professor, a biology professor who was an atheist, I asked him this question in front of several people: which would be the greater wrong, to kill a human baby or to kill a baby bald eagle? He, without even hesitating, he replied, it would be the greater wrong to kill the eagle because it's in danger of becoming extinct. And that shows exactly where the atheist stands with regard to human life. And he views human beings as merely animals, where that's all we are. That's part of the problem in our country, that is the United States and the Western world in general, because they've swallowed this view, the view of organic macroevolution, which we've already set forth as being flawed, logically flawed. And that is, it does not and cannot exist or occur because of the probability is too low. Even atheists talk about the probability as we've dealt with in prior lessons. Now, cockroaches, what about them? The civil government requires that restaurant owners eradicate cockroaches. And cockroaches are known to be carriers of various diseases, salmonella, and so forth, the diseases on the screen here. So they're responsible for spread of several diseases that kill humans. And so the federal government, the state government, the city and the county governments in the United States and in a lot of other countries will order or demand that the cockroaches all be killed, including the baby cockroaches. But in fact, the atheist makes no distinction between a baby cockroach and a baby human. They make no distinction whatsoever. And so we're going to make an a fortiori argument here. It's on the screen. If sin, spiritual disease, is more serious than physical disease, the eradication of those that are spreading sin is more necessary than eradicating those that spread physical diseases, cockroaches, for example. And so it's more necessary. And it's required. Spiritual disease is certainly more serious than physical disease. Of course, the atheist doesn't believe that. That's part of his problem. This is, again, an a fortiori argument. So the eradication of those who are spreading sin, spiritual disease, is more necessary than eradicating things that spread physical diseases. So that's my basic argument. It's an a fortiori argument. The second flaw in the argument is that atheism can logically assert that any action is immoral. Why? because they have no higher power to appeal to. We laid this out in page 405 in the book, earlier in this book, that you can't get moral code, you can't get morality at all without an omniscient being who is omnibenevolent. And so you have to have a being who has at least two of the attributes of God in order to get someone who can tell you what is right and wrong and always be right in what he tells you. So a person, a human, does not have the knowledge and does not have the nature to be able to always determine what is good and what is evil. And you can see this by various idolatrous religions that were created and have been created. And those idolatrous religions do not do what is good, have evil things being done to satisfy the pagan gods that they have. So the atheist is guilty of special pleading. He can't say murder is wrong, but he's saying it's wrong, and he can't say it's wrong without there being a God, or a being at least that has at least two of the characteristics of God: omniscience and omnibenevolence. And without that, there's no way of saying anything is right and wrong, morally good, morally evil. So he's guilty of the fallacy of special pleading, because he condemns the God of the Bible for an action that he cannot say is wrong without the God of the Bible. So he gets into a quandary. He then is in a situation where he has a situation where it's self-contradictory, and he's guilty of that special pleading problem as well. We developed this point earlier, and most of those who support abortion, for example, are the explicit or implicit atheist. I believe a person who rejects the inerrancy of the scriptures is an implicit atheist. And he will be an implicit atheist, at least atheist in the sense he doesn't believe in the God of the Bible. If sound hermeneutics is applied to the scriptures and they teach that abortion is murder, I believe it's in the very next appendix. But I've recorded 4 lessons on this, which we will attach to the end of this file on our YouTube link. So we won't be going through that. I've already recorded those 3 or 4 years ago. If the atheist responds to this argument by saying that Christianity claims that such actions are wrong, then he's tacitly admitting that he can't say it's wrong. He's just trying to say we say it's wrong. So then we get into another problem, and we get to the principle: if it's for the higher good, and that is, and we'll show various other arguments based upon the premise that the Bible teaches that murder is wrong. So we'll be dealing with this later. We've already set forth one argument, and he leaves himself open to that argument, that atheism, because he can't give a reason why it's wrong except to say you Christians believe it's wrong. And so he's responsible. He's leaving himself open to the argument that atheism is responsible for evil because they can't determine good and evil. And so much of the evil in the world, not all of it, but much of it is caused by atheism. Dawkins, and we quoted this in chapter 2, in pages 80 through 85, he admits that the atheist has no system to determine good and evil. He can't determine it. And science itself cannot, by the very nature of science, determine what is good and evil. It can tell you what happens, it can't tell you why it happens. And it can't tell you why, and it can't tell you what's good and evil, whether what happens is good or evil. Neither atheists nor agnostics are condemning abortion, and this is killing of unborn babies, appendix N, and yet they're condemning God. So this is another example of the fallacy of special pleading. They'll kill unborn babies, but they will condemn God for what he did. So now we have to lay this out more clearly now. There's a third flaw, That's the ones, only the ones who have the right to condemn God are the ones who have died or killed. And of course, everybody is in one or two categories. They're either a person who is under the age of accountability by either not being old enough or by not being mentally capable of knowing right from wrong. And then those who are over the age of accountability, that is, they are accountable for their actions and they have sinned. So we have two groups. Everybody's in one of those two categories. The ones over the age of accountability will get up to sin. We see this in Romans 3:23, where Paul said, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The word all there has to be defined by context. It's Jew and Gentile, which would include everybody in the world, except, of course, when we look at the rest of the Bible, it wouldn't include Jesus because he was perfect, and it wouldn't include those under the age of accountability. So only those over the age of accountability, except Jesus, was what we have that exception. So God is righteous. He was righteous to take their lives because they'd sinned. Their very thoughts, as we look at Genesis 6:5, the thoughts of their heart were only evil continually. So we get into this passage, and it tells us that these people of the pre-flood time, or the antediluvian, we call it anti-A-N-T-E, diluvian, before the flood, that they were exceedingly wicked. And the Lord, or Yahweh, or Jehovah, saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I want to highlight that, as you see what I'm talking about here. It's right here, that their thoughts were only evil continually. That's all they thought, evil. And we'll get back to this. We'll come back to this as we develop this now. And repented the Lord, or Jehovah, that he had made man on the earth, and he grieved him in his heart. God is grieved at sin. And the Lord, or Jehovah, said, I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the ground, both man and beast, and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I had repented me that I had made them. So we have a group of people here in the antediluvian world who was punished because the very thoughts of the hearts, all the thoughts of the hearts, every imagination of the hearts, that's the same word for all, was evil continually. It just continued in this, not just for a while, but they continued in it. And we're going to look at another group of people, Genesis 15:16, where God is speaking to Abraham, or Abram, his name was at that time, I believe, maybe Abraham. But God changed his name to Abram from Abram to Abraham. But he's speaking to him, and the Lord, or Jehovah, said, because of the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, because their sin is very grievous. So here their sin is very grievous. So right here we have that. Their sin is very grievous. And I would argue that that's the same as saying, as we had up here, every imagination of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. I'm arguing they're saying the same thing, and I'll show it in just a minute. Give you an argument for that. So their sin was very grievous. I will go down now and see. And that doesn't mean God didn't know, but God was going to provide evidence to the world, to mankind, that these people were just evil and their sin was very grievous. Whether that had done to get altogether according to the cry of it, which is coming to me, and if not, I will know. Keel and Delitzsch explain the expression of their sin is very grievous. I know they're commentators, but they're Hebrew scholars. And they say literally to make completeness, here referring to the extremity of iniquity, generally into the extremity of punishment as well, as we see in page 204, 230 of their commentary. So I cite this in the plot in the index of the books that are cited bibliography. And certainly God is both immutable. We know that from Malachi 3:6 and Hebrews 13:8. For I change not, therefore yield, sons of men are not destroyed or not. And so God doesn't change according to Malachi 3:6. Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. Hebrews 13:8. So the second person of Godhead doesn't change either. So God is immutable, and he's totally righteous. He's just, and the word just and righteous are the same. Psalm 11:7. There are other verses that teach that God is righteous. So my argument is this. If God is both immutable and totally righteous, then God judged the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and the Amorites, by the same standard of judgment. I didn't put the scripture in for the Amorites, but let me go back to it and cite it so you can at least see it. That's Genesis 15:16. Okay. That would be them. I didn't put them in there. Okay. He said to Abraham that the sins of the Amorites were not yet full. Their sins weren't full yet. So God is just. So if, back to my argument, if God is both immutable and totally righteous or just, then God judged the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and the Amorites, by the same standard of judgment. The Amorites, their iniquity was full when the children of Israel went into the land of Canaan. So they lost their land. They weren't going to lose it, and Abraham's descendants couldn't have it until the iniquity was full. That's the point. So God is both immutable and totally righteous. Therefore, God judged, or conclusion, God judged the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and the Amorites, by the same standard of judgment. So these three expressions then that we've laid out here are equal in meaning. So our conclusion is, if God judged the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and the Amorites, by the same standard of judgment, then the reasons for destroying the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and the Amorites, are identical. So now we've equated three expressions. We can argue that he did do this. He judged them by the same standard. So the second premise. So the reason for destroying the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and Amorites, are identical. We had the same reasons, maybe in different words, but they're saying basically the same thing. So if the reasons for destroying the antediluvian people, the people of Sodom and Amorites, are identical, then, and I'll highlight it, people's iniquity being full, and that would be the Amorites, is equal to every, as is the thought of the heart's only evil continually, that's antediluvian, and their sin is very grievous, that's Sodom and Gomorrah. So these three terms are equal in meaning. And so we're arguing that the reason for destroying the Amorites are identical. And then we argue that these three expressions are equal. Now, any questions? Developing this a little further, this supports the following argument. If and only if, that's a biconditional. And remember, if a biconditional, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are not fallacies. And you can affirm the consequent and it's correct, and you can deny the antecedent and it's correct, because it's biconditional. If and only if a group of people's iniquity is full, then a group of people warrant total destruction. All right? So if and only if that occurs, they warrant total destruction. The group of people in Genesis 6:5-7 warranted total destruction. And so the group of peoples in Genesis 6, iniquity, group of people's iniquity in Genesis 6:5. I should put the word iniquity in here. Genesis 6:5 warranted total destruction. The group of people's iniquity in Genesis 6:5 was full. So the iniquity was full. So the conclusion of this argument will tell us more about their iniquity being full. Okay. So if and only if their iniquity is full, then the group of people warranted total destruction. These people warranted total destruction. Right. And I need to make that. That'll take care of that. I had a typo error. I corrected it. Now then, let's go to first premise. If and only if a group of people of iniquity in Genesis 6, the people's iniquity in Genesis 6, 5 through 7 was full, then the people's iniquity, the group's iniquity being full, occurred when the thoughts of their heart are only evil continually, and their sin is very grievous. It's the biconditional. And of course, their iniquity was full. We're affirming the antecedent normal affirmation. A group's iniquity being full occurred when the thoughts of the heart were only evil continued and their sin was grievous. So we're equating these three expressions. Now, I know we're getting into just one syllogism after another, but it proves our case here. This leads us to the following conclusion. If a group of people's iniquity is full, there is no room for them to raise their children to serve God. And a group of people's iniquity is full, for example, we see in 1 Samuel 15, 1 through 3. This would be the Amalekites, or some pronounce it Amalekites or Amalekites. And so I heard it pronounced both ways. There's no room for them to raise their children to serve God. See, if their iniquity is full, and their thoughts, their hearts only evil continually, and the other expression that was used applies to them, then they're not going to raise their children to serve God. And if a whole nation is that way, then there's nobody to influence the children to do good and reject evil. Their iniquity was full, and there's no room for them to raise their children to serve God. So the iniquity of the Amalekites, or Amalekites, was full in 1 Samuel 15, 1 through 3. And certainly they cannot accuse God of injustice because the adults were guilty of sin. The children under the age of Calvary could not be said to deserve to die for any wrongdoing on their part. After the young children, and I would digress, and not in the book here, but the people are in our country now are getting into what they call euthanasia, mercy killings. They're going to kill someone to get rid of them because they're suffering and in their suffering. And one of the arguments for abortion is that children are going to grow up unloved, or children are going to grow up to be problems in their homes and so forth. And they just get rid of them. So they're arguing that we can eliminate them if it's for a merciful cause. So you see, they're guilty of another fallacy here, and this would be the fallacy of taking the same position that we're taking, and having to take that. Special pleading, it's called. Let's go back to this paragraph, though. If their iniquity was full, then they cannot accuse God of injustice. The children of the age of accountability could not be said to deserve to die. After the young children below the age of accountability died, Luke 16:22 and 2 Samuel 12:23, they would be in a state of bliss. It would be in paradise. God had and still has the power to resurrect them, and they will be resurrected at some time. If they desire to leave the state of total bliss, return to this vale of tears, this earth, God could have done it. Now, we're saying God has that power. I'm not saying he did offer them that, but I'm saying he could have. And that's logically possible. They would certainly have sinned, Romans 3:23, and if they had been thrust back into their role where all they had as parents that were totally evil and the whole society was evil, they would no doubt have sinned and not had any influence to influence them for good. If they had been raised by their wicked parents, they would have become wicked, assuming that the iniquity of their parents was full. So, this is the problem now. These children would grow up to be totally depraved. The early Christians viewed death in the proper light. They desired to die and go with the Lord, Philippians 1:21-24. They use the word Maranatha, which is Aramaic for Chaldean for come Lord Jesus, our Lord cometh or will come. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 7, the day of death is better than the day of birth. He's talking about, of course, the person who is righteous, not a wicked person, or a person that is going to go into paradise. And we said of one who is not lost. Now, understand, not lost means it would apply to those below the age of accountability. They're not lost. And so they're not responsible for their deeds, as we see in Revelation 14:13. Those who died under the age of accountability won't rise up and condemn God in the day of judgment for providing them with eternal bliss. They won't stand up and say God did wrong. When they realized, and if they would be made to realize, that they would not have been raised, they would not have had any chance to have been saved, because they had no influence from their parents or their whole nation was wicked. And there was no good in their nation whatsoever. So total depravity occurs. I believe in it. I just don't. I believe some people are totally depraved. I don't know who they are. And I'm going to teach everybody if I can. But there are people that are so evil and wicked, they just enjoy killing other people, hurting other people, and doing harm to other people. And we see young people in this mode. Sometimes they go out and vandalize people's cars and houses and places and businesses. And with no gain on their part, they just do it. It's just mean. And they've got to get around that disposition in order to become Christians. You have to give it up. So the gospel has the power to change people, but if they're not going to hear God's word in any way, shape, form, or fashion, then there's no way to change them. They're not going to be changed. I'm not claiming that these people, I believe some are totally depraved. I'm not saying all are totally depraved. I'm saying some are, but I'm not claiming that total depravity is inherited. I put that in bold print so you wouldn't miss it. And it's not inherited, it's acquired as a result of not being taught. Children are born neutral. And if there's nobody around that's going to teach them to choose the good and reject the evil, as we see in the 7th chapter of Isaiah, then they're going to be evil. They won't have any leading to lead them to the truth. You see the problem in Genesis 18:20. Their sin was grievous. The iniquity of the Amorites was full, and the children of Israel took the land of Canaan. It wasn't full in Genesis 15:16, so they weren't given the land. Abraham wasn't given the land at that time for that reason. And every imagination and thoughts of their heart were evil. Those kind of people are totally depraved. And we see Judah had this problem in Jeremiah 13:20-27 when I delve into it. Stop me if you have a question along the way or a comment to make. Right.
I would like to interject if I may.
All right.
Where does God's providence come into this? If at all.
God's providence, and all of these that we're looking at here were under the patriarchal law, except children of Israel weren't. And when we see this with the Amalekites. But God's providence, he has provided prophets I believe, in the Old Testament under the patriarchal law. I believe he had prophets among the Gentiles, but they just killed them and wouldn't listen to them, the way the children of Israel did too. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to do what was good. And so they had chosen to do evil and to reject the good. So choose the good, do the good, reject the evil, as Isaiah 7 said. So providence comes in. They were no doubt given opportunities, but probably they killed those prophets. The Amalekites probably did. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
I think they were the same disposition that the Jews were when they killed the prophets. Jesus told the Jews of his time, who I think some of them had almost become totally depraved. When they would kill a righteous man who had done no wrong and had done only good, because they would lose their place, I think they were just pretty well totally depraved. Those people were. And so they were the disposition to kill the prophets. And so the blood of all the prophets came upon them, not because they were guilty of the individual prophets, but they were that disposition. I think the Amalekites were that way. The Sodom and Gomorrah, you can look at that. They were, Noah was a prophet. He preached to them and they didn't listen to him. So I would say, yes, they had the prophets, but they wouldn't listen. And they sought to kill them. And they were the ones who killed the prophets and ridiculed them, made fun of them. Right? Any other questions or comments? Good.
I was thought about providence, and I also wondered the degree to which somebody's responsible when they're raised in that situation. They certainly, how do they then learn to choose right from wrong?
Well, they may have had someone that tried to teach them, but they wouldn't listen. And but when you get a society that's that corrupt, they'll kill those who try to come to them. Okay? Now, those below the age of accountability are not responsible yet. And so God was merciful and allowed them to die before they reach the age of accountability, so they will not be lost. And that's the beauty of the thing. These people were destined, had they lived under the situation they grew up under, that they were born under, the Amalekites and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and the ones that entered the living. We don't even know that there were children alive when the flood came, but we'll get back to that later. But so I would argue that God was being merciful. These children, when they died, they were ceased from being able to sin. So at that point, they're safe, and so they'll be in paradise. Does that help a bit? I don't know if it might.
I need to think a little bit more through it, but I appreciate your comments.
Okay. Since children are born neutral, and we laid this out on page 159 to 160, they must be taught to refuse evil and choose good, Isaiah 7:16. If both the parents and all of society are totally depraved and they're going to kill the prophets that come to them, and they were that disposition, then there's no one who would teach the children to refuse evil, choose good. And we see in our society, the children in our schools are being taught there is no God, and so they're not going to listen to the scriptures. And so we're getting a group of people that are getting worse and worse. And that's exactly what we expect to happen, because they have no reason to think anything is evil or good. So I think we're seeing that in our very nation, the United States, at this present time. So we see then that there's no way to tell them that they need to be good, have no reason to be good, and no reason to abstain from evil, because they don't believe in God. And these people, people of Sodom and the people that had to live in the world, we don't know what they did, except that they were totally evil. Now let's look at the fourth flaw in the argument. Let's move on. And this argument assumes that the babies were killed in the flood of Genesis 6. That babies were killed. The scriptures state that God closed the wombs of the women of Genesis 20, verse 18. And I think that's with Abraham, and of course, when they tried to take Sarah as a wife. And it's certainly possible that he also did this during the period before the flood. We don't know whether he did or didn't. The Bible doesn't explicitly say any babies died in the flood. So it might be that God closed the wombs and they just didn't have any children. And during this time, there were no children born to be old enough to sin. It's possible that happened. If he prevented women to have children for several years before the flood, then we might have had not any children die in the flood. I think it's of note that Shem, Ham, and Japheth were around 100 years old, each of them in that neighborhood, but they had no children as yet. Didn't have children until after the flood. But that still leaves us with the problem of 1 Samuel 15:3. The fifth flaw in this argument contains a logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. Here's his basic argument. If a Christian, and they'll say if Marion Fox, or put your name there, can set forth an explanation of how God can be good while committing the killing of certain people, then there's an explanation for how God can be good while killing of certain people. Well, if I can give you an explanation, then there is an explanation. That's certainly true. That first premise is true. But then if you look at the second premise, they'll say, well, that the Christian cannot set forth an explanation. So you can't give us an explanation. They're affirming denying the antecedent. And so they've committed that fallacy in their reasoning. It's a fallacy of argument from ignorance. Just because I don't know of a way, which of course is also a fallacy of denying antecedent when they frame it right. So they say, well, there's no explanation. Well, just because I don't have one doesn't mean there isn't one. I'm setting forth plausible explanations for it. Right? Note the antecedent is denied. Logically, that's a problem if any invalid arguments are unsound. And of course, let's look at the first premise and see its flaw. If he can set forth an explanation what God can do while commanding the killing of certain people, then there is an explanation. In the second premise, he says a Christian cannot set forth an explanation how God be good when commanding the killing of certain people. They have actually, with this one, they have begged the question because we've already given some arguments for it, explanations already in this, and they're all plausible. Okay. Now, when we think of death as being good, that's something that bothers atheists. They don't understand that, and to the atheist, death is the end of everything. He dies as one that has no hope. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And if you had just two options, let's say you give it two options. To die right now and be assured of heaven, guaranteed you're going to go to heaven and live several more years and have a zero probability of heaven. And in addition to suffer the horrors of hell, you'd certainly, if you had a choice, you'd choose the first option, to die right now. If you understood what hell is, and understood you couldn't in any way go to heaven. And under those conditions, if you had a choice, you'd always take the first option, unless you were insane. If you're insane, you wouldn't lose your soul anyhow, okay? Unless you became insane after you reached the age of accountability. The Lord has the power to grant them these two options. We cannot say he did or did not. But this, of course, gives us a plausible explanation for it. And the children of both the Amalekites and Sodom and the pre-flood mankind would most certainly have been raised to be wicked like their parents. And we see that the influence of prophets in that time did not influence these people to change. We see this in the days of Noah. He was a preacher of righteousness. He preached and got no converts except his immediate family, his wife and his 3 sons and his 3 daughters-in-law. We see also the angels went to Sodom and they tried to commit homosexual rape with them. And of course the angels stopped them, of course. But if we study carefully, Lot was a preacher of righteousness also, and they wouldn't listen to him. So they didn't listen to Lot. So he preached to them, and the New Testament tells us he did. So they had God's word and wouldn't listen to it. They became so totally depraved, and they were raising their children to be that way. Now we're doing the same thing in our schools right now. We're raising our children to disbelieve in God and to say that there is no such thing as good and evil. Right? I believe God had the power to grant them the options, these two options, and I can't say whether he whether he did it or not, but I say that's an option. It's a possible explanation. these options that I've given are sufficient to prove that God wasn't doing wrong. And so I don't know which one's correct or if there's another answer, but I trust God to always do what's right. Samuel was bothered to have to leave paradise in 1 Samuel 28:8-15, even for a brief time. So I don't think people who went to paradise would want to come back. They'd want to stay there. And the atheists must agree that this answers the charge God is unjust. It's a plausible answer. He just may not like the answer, but it's plausible. God may have treated them fairly another way, but he did what's right. And he always does. Genesis 18:25. Now, does this give humans the right to kill babies? Well, some would say, well, now that of course means we can kill babies, not necessarily so. So the atheist could respond and say, well, that'd be mean we're all right to kill babies, and you're saying we're wrong to abort babies. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. Comparison between a human and God is flawed because God can know the future. He can know the character of man. He can know if a person is totally depraved. He can know if society is totally given over. I think when America gets towards totally given over to evil, I think we will be destroyed. Our nation will be. I have no doubt in my mind. If that happens, we will be destroyed. And I think nations can fall. I think the Nazis were evil to the core, and they had to be taken out. And it was the Nazis, many of them were killed, and they ceased to rule. I say, we see the same thing in the Japanese of World War II. And so we see this going on, and God is in control providentially, and he will take these people out eventually. And he does it sometimes in a surgical way, not necessarily everybody in the whole society. The Nicodemus was full. They were so corrupt they did not raise their children. Only God can know when this is true. Destruction of the young of some races was not commanded. In fact, they were allowed to let them live. We see this in Numbers 31:17-20. This tells me that some of those people weren't totally depraved. And obviously their naked was not full yet. See, they were not given over totally. Thoughts of their heart weren't evil continually, see. So right there, this tells me that these people weren't in that category. So because they were allowed to live, he distinguished between them and some of the other groups. And since they were not totally depraved, their young children were spared. Now we do have, God is different, of course, than man. We know that. If God exists and both heaven and hell exist, that's pretty clear. It's axiomatic, self-evident. The God of the Bible I'm talking about exists. And spiritual matters are infinitely more important than carnal, having to do with the flesh matters. Of course, God exists, and therefore both heaven and hell exist, and spiritual matters are infinitely more important than carnal, having to do with the flesh matters. So we know this to be the truth. It's evident. This leads us to the following argument. If both heaven and hell exist, spiritual matters are infinitely more important than carnal matters, having to do with the flesh matters, then what follows, ending the life of a young child prematurely is good if it would have been totally depraved and died in sin had it been allowed to live. So it's actually beneficial to the child if he would have not grown up to be right, if he didn't have a chance of it, didn't have an opportunity. And both heaven and hell exist, of course, they do, and spiritual matters are infinitely more important than carnal. Having to do with flesh matters, a fortiori argument, of course. So ending the life of a young child prematurely is good if it would have become totally depraved and died in sin. And only God can know when that occurs, so humans can't make that choice. So God was making the choice for the greater good, the salvation of the souls of the young children, is what he was doing. And so that was, and of course the atheists now are advocating mercy killings. And so they can't argue that we're wrong. This is a mercy killing in the highest sense. You're killing them to allow them to go to heaven instead of wind up in hell. So the little babies were allowed to die for that reason. So it put more people in heaven as a result. Any questions or comments there? I know that's kind of a hard saying, but that's, I believe, logically sound. The Canaanites, yes.
One thought. Been thinking about what James had questioned a little earlier up above, and would wondering about them maybe not having the chance to learn what God wants of them to do when they were being totally annihilated. Would Romans chapter 1, starting at verse 18 and following, come into play?
They became that way.
Yeah,
and, I mean, I don't know. There's some societies that
because it says in verse 20, it says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse."
But you see, they would, in the position of their society, they're taught to reject and totally reject God, and so they're not going to interpret that evidence properly,
right?
Because of the influence of their totally depraved society. That's what I'm claiming.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. Now let's look at the Canaanites now. We won't read these verses. I'll let you read them yourself, but they were certainly infected with some kinds of diseases. You see this in Exodus 15:26, Deuteronomy 7:15 and 28, verses 58 through 61, and some other passages. Miscarriages were one of the problems that they seem to have. Exodus 23 through 26. And we know now that miscarriages are linked in at least some instances, not all instances, some instances, with venereal disease such as gonorrhea. So it's possible that, I'm not saying that all miscarriages are linked to gonorrhea, do not take it that way. It's possible that Canaanites who engage in all sorts of sexual sins, heterosexual fornication, sodomy, and bestiality, were infected with diseases such as gonorrhea or AIDS or syphilis or PIV or chlamydia or other diseases like that. And the implications of these diseases, they can produce blindness and infertility and scarred fallopian tubes, gonorrhea, and so forth. There are lots of things that these diseases can cause. So it's possible that there exists, or existed even, this venereal disease could make AIDS look mild. During that time, the disease were wiped out by the action of children of Israel. If you start having sex with animals, for example, and homosexual relations, there are different parts of the body that work differently. And semen was not made to go up into the rectum of a man. And his rectum was not made for that, and that semen can cause other problems. Having sex with an animal, there could be diseases that they have, viruses they have that humans don't have. And they could spread it to the humans, and those viruses may kill people to cause other problems. One of the theories, early theories about AIDS was that it came from having sex with monkeys. And I don't know whether there's any truth to that or not, but that's one of the theories that was set forth. In Numbers 31, 17 through 20 and 35, the children of Israel were allowed to keep the young girls that had not known a man, that is, that were virgins, not had sexual relations, and allow them to live. But they were going to kill all the women and the men. Is it possible that these people were infected with some venereal disease? See, they were told to kill all of them in some groups, but they were allowed to let other groups of children live and even marry the little girls that were virgins. And so if they were virgins, they're not likely to be infected with venereal disease. So it might be that there are other reasons that we are not aware of. I'm going to say that I'm not going to let them say you're ignorant of it, therefore you must be wrong. I'm saying God has options, all the options I've given here, and maybe options that I'm not wise enough to figure out. Any questions? So he has other options. It's possible he does. And we have options available to him. I've set forth some. And Appendix R shows how arguments in this appendix demonstrate the existence of God. The Bible is not inconsistent with his actions. So in Appendix R, I've shown that. We'll take a break at this time. We'll come back and we'll do Appendix U, and we'll be through with the class after that. Any questions or comments?
Good class. Appreciate it.